Good afternoon. My name is Kevin Quigley. I'm the Scholarly Director of the McKechnie Institute for Public Policy and Governance. Thanks so much for joining us today for this important discussion called Come Hell or High Water, Improving Emergency Response for People with Disabilities. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we're here today on traditional Mi'kmaq territory. We also recognize the histories, contributions, and legacies of the African Nova Scotian people who've been here for over 400 years. Since 2016, the McKechnie Institute has held over 100 events with more than 8,000 attendees. Over the years, we've held panels on topics such as climate change, racial justice, and this year we've had discussions about health equity and health ethics for a series called Healthcare Reconsidered. Today, we'll be discussing a topic that has been an area of research for the McKechnie Institute for some time: emergency response of people with disabilities. We'd like to acknowledge we've received funding from the Accessibility Standards Canada and the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council to support this event, and we also would like to recognize the numerous academic and professional partners that have been part of our research in this area. Recently, the Atlantic region experienced a major emergency in the form of post-tropical storm Fiona. There was the usual advice given for emergency planning, such as having enough supplies for 72 hours, and in extreme cases, people should prepare to evacuate. But often the experiences and unique needs of people with disabilities are not taken into account. This is not simply a practical and ethical issue, it's also a legal one. So what can governments, communities, and individuals do to better support persons with disabilities during emergencies? Our speakers today will speak on the topic from a research and professional perspective, as well as from a lived experience. We'll hear from each speaker, and then there'll be a Q&A when we invite questions from our online audience, and we ask you to think of your questions during the panel, and then you can submit your questions in the chat function of the online service. On that note, I'd like to introduce our first speaker. Our first speaker is Stephen Estey. For more than 30 years, Stephen has worked with disabled people's organizations, human rights institutions, governments, intergovernmental organizations, and United Nations agencies to advance disability rights. He's the former national coordinator of the Council of Canadians and Disabilities, whose motto is "A Voice of Our Own." Stephen is also a former human rights officer at Disabled Peoples International, a Canadian-based non-governmental organization that works globally to advance the human rights of persons with disabilities. So on that, I'll ask Stephen to offer some opening thoughts on our topic today. Stephen.
Just putting on my timer here. Keep me honest. Good morning, everyone. Or I assume it's everyone. We're talking to a TV screen here, but I hope there are folks out there. My name is Steve Estey, as Kevin said, and I'm actually a graduate of this fine institution many decades ago. I did my master's degree in international development studies here at Dallin St. Mary's in the 1990s. So it's a delight to be here today. I'm going to talk a little bit about my work with the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities and how it connects to this emergency measures and disaster preparedness stuff. Now, I was involved with the drafting of the CRPD in the early 2000s. We started in 2002 and went through until 2006. And over those 4 years, I traveled several times to New York as part of the Canadian government delegation to do the drafting on the convention. And in 2004, you may remember, if you're as old as I am, at least you'll remember, that there was a big tsunami in the Pacific. And many tens of thousands of people were killed. And that happened, and it was, something that everyone was talking about for a long period of time. And we were doing drafting around the convention. And there hadn't been a discussion up until that time about the specifics of people in emergency situations. We talked about a lot of different kinds of rights: the right to education, the right to health, the right to participate in public and political life, all of those kinds of things. But there hadn't been a focus on emergency preparedness. But all of a sudden, in 2004, that's what everyone was talking about. So I remember being in the meeting room when had about 100 different countries participating in the drafting of this, and the chair of the committee was ambassador from New Zealand named Don McKay. And he talked about the fact that we ought to have a provision in the convention around emergency situations. So we began the drafting. What is now Article 11 of the CRPD talks about situations of risk. And it was interesting because at that time, there was a real focus on, the tsunami and people who were in really just what's the word? That we're just in very difficult situations because of the fact that they lost their communities and things like that. So we talked about that. But if you look at the actual provision itself, it talks about that kind of being in a dire situation and so on. But it also opens the door to looking at the root causes of these things. And over the 15 years or so since the convention entered into force, it was in 2007 it entered into force, the discussion around situations of risk has kind of evolved from that, what you do when you lose your house kind of thing, to instead a larger kind of conversation about global warming and climatic change and the things that underpin these situations. So here in Nova Scotia, we recently experienced this hurricane, and that focuses our attention on the immediate situation. But the scholarship and academics around this over the last 15 years have evolved to talk more about the kind of underpinnings of global warming and things like that. So what you see in the academic world is a discussion around Article 11 has really become a discussion about global warming and how people with disabilities are impacted by that. So in terms of work with the convention, we did the drafting in the early 2000s, and now what happens is there's a monitoring mechanism that comes into play, and every 4 years, countries that have ratified the convention, are obliged to report about how they're meeting their obligations under the convention. So if you look at the Canadian government report, our first report was in 2015, I think. And we talked a bit about the situation in terms of what was happening with our emergency response thing. But in the discussion that was had with the CRPD committee in Geneva, the committee began to ask questions about what we're doing about responding to global warming kinds of situations. And now we're in the process of drafting our second report on the convention. And one of the things that I do is facilitate that discussion. And we're talking much more now about the global warming situation and the things that the government of Canada is doing to talk about or to address the situation of people with disabilities in that context of global warming and so on. And there are a number of academics across the country and around the world that are looking at these kinds of things. There's a lot of work going on at McGill University right now on this. So I think maybe I should just leave it at that at this point in time, just kind of open up a door. Maybe when we come to a discussion, we can have some back and forth discussion about that. So I'm going to be quiet now and pass it on to the next person, okay?
Thank you so much, Steve, and that's a great for us. We'll now turn to Donalda MacIsaac. Donalda has been a dedicated full-time healthcare and social change advocate for her entire adult life, and has served in a variety of roles in local, provincial, and national organizations. She serves as family patient advisor for Dalhousie Family Medicine and for various Nova Scotia health committees. She has and continues to work tirelessly on behalf of people in need, helping them to navigate the systems of government and maintain the services they require while fighting for improved services and increased accessibility. Donalda.
Thank you, Kevin. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for this opportunity that we have to bring this to the table. Fiona, interesting. You know, we hear all this excitement right now about starting a registry for vulnerable people. This has been going on since where we have been trying to get attention brought to these different areas. Home care is an area where you'll find a lot of vulnerable people, but you don't know where they're at, you don't know who they are, and you don't know why they're there and what their situations are. But what we do know is that each one of those situations has a story behind it. And whenever there's a crisis that comes, we hear about bad weather, the fear that comes into a lot of people who are dealing with disabilities is unbelievable. I know in my own case, I did everything I knew to do to prepare for Fiona, because since we did all the things that we needed to do, generators and everything that we were able to do. The one thing that we weren't prepared for in Fiona was our telecommunication system going down, leaving tons of people vulnerable, afraid, and without any form of assistance. This is something that we have to change. We cannot allow this to happen again. We need to make sure that our structures are accountable for these different things. Nova Scotia Power has a critical care line that we can learn some things from that critical care line to put into our own everyday way of dealing with these situations. It's hard when you're in these situations to come up with a solution when you have no communication. The communication went down. I have a landline phone to make sure that when power goes out and anything goes out, we had a way to be connected. Well, telecommunications company didn't tell me that once fiber op came, my landline was not going to work anymore once the power went out. I was without any form of communication for 5 days. I put my sneakers by the door because I thought, okay, if I'm in a crisis with my son, who is very vulnerable, I have to run to the nearest fire station to get help. These are situations where it should not be. We should not have an invisible part of our population that nobody recognizes that they're there. If my roof comes off, I can't go anywhere. If the car comes up and down my street and asks everybody to evacuate, I can't evacuate. This, I don't know if you can see it clearly. This is the bed that my son sleeps in. This bed has to be assembled in the room where it's at and cannot be unassembled. So there's no way for me to evacuate with this bed. We need to have emergency measures in place for these types of situations. We also have facilities where people can go to, but we have to make sure that we have facilities that are geared up to be able to meet the needs of the vulnerable population that is going to be going to those facilities. And how do we get them there? Right now, HRM and the emergency measures have this on their radar. And so they're looking into this, but it's more than just creating a list. I know we're all talking about creating a vulnerable persons list. It goes beyond creating a vulnerable persons list. We have to know how to transport people. We have to know what to do in those circumstances. We also need to create what I believe we need to go back to a human chain, because our telecommunication system failed this time, big time. And our governments need to step in and make sure that this does not happen, that we keep them accountable, because we need to make sure that people are able to have it. And if we're going to create a system that's going to work, we have to make sure it's not just based on volunteers. It has to be funded so that we know that the people needing these different situations will come. And home care is one of the areas where we need to put a bigger focus on when we're talking about storms and things coming, because people in long-term care facilities is one thing, but when you're talking about people in their homes, it's very, very different. We have to make sure that we're able to reach these people. And we can start different lines by connecting with the medical community, connecting with Nova Scotia Power, connecting with all the people who may have a vulnerable persons list already. And we can improve on that list and add people to that list. But what we have to be careful of, we don't want to create a bunch of silos. We have too many silos now. We want to have it so that we can have it as central as possible so that it works for the people that really need it. There's an invisible population, but there's still an important population. And they need to be recognized. And we need to make sure that you also recognize that you're just not talking about the person with disabilities. You're talking in some cases about their caregiver as well. So it's a whole ball of wax here that you have to look at. And I can tell you from my own personal experience in Fiona, I would like to say it was an anxiety attack, but I would tell you that it was beyond that. Fear was unbelievable. Fear felt like it just wrapped its arms around me and held me because I didn't know what to do. I could not communicate with the outside world. And I had no way of dealing with that. And so we have to make sure governments keep these telecommunications agencies accountable. And we don't have time to do this for the next 5 years. We need to make sure that we have something in place for our next storm. Thank you.
Thank you, Donalda. I'll just make a quick note that Dr. Katie Albrecht, who would plan to be here today, but due to unforeseen circumstances is unable to join us. But Kaitlynne Lowe is here. She was scheduled to be here, and she will be carrying the research load for us in the sense that the McKechnie Institute has been doing lots of research in this area. Katie's been doing some. Kaitlynne Lowe has been doing some. And so Kaitlynne will be talking a little about her research. Kaitlynne Lowe has spent the past 4 years conducting research work at the McKechnie Institute of Public Policy and Governance. Her work is focused on accessibility issues in Canada's emergency management response to improve the experience of persons with disabilities. She's an Action Canada Fellow, year 2021, and a graduate of the Master of Public Administration program here at Dow. Her current research is examining how emergency evacuation processes support people with disabilities and improvements that can be made specifically regarding risk communication and return to the community. So on that note, Kaitlynne Lowe. Kaitlynne.
Hi, everyone. So I have a presentation that is going to be going along with our research today to try and keep things as clear as possible for you. But we've been working with a number of partners to try and understand different phases of evacuation, including communication, alert, transportation, shelter, and then return to the community. Starting with so communication alert, and then Dr. Katie Albrecht has been taking care of the shelter piece. And so the entire purpose of our project has been to understand how we can improve communication about evacuation and emergency responses to people with disabilities. And again, we're looking at sort of the 4 stages of evacuation. We've reviewed scholarly literature and other public material, including various reports and different media articles to try and capture some of the stories and lived experiences that have been happening in disasters past. And we're able to survey 29 people with disabilities, including some caregivers, as well as 8 emergency managers to understand different considerations in both perspectives. And as part of our project, we've had an advisory board comprised of scholars, disability advocacy organizations, and other public and private partners and emergency management offices. And we've been seeking feedback from these folks throughout each stage of the research, including feedback on final products, such as our roundtable in June this past summer. Next slide, please. And so from the literature, we see that many different factors influence how individuals receive risks and will therefore act on them. So they look to the behaviors of others, particularly loved ones, family members, neighbors, as well as look to their own personal experiences with risk and whether they've been through a storm before, how they were successfully or unsuccessfully able to navigate those conditions. Some paramount things are trust in institutions and authorities, including various sources of information. So people aren't necessarily responding to information received from the same source in the same way. Different people will trust different sources of information more than others, and trust in authorities also is a big factor into that. And then you have socio-demographic factors such as age, race, gender, income, and primary language and ability that all also factor into how someone may perceive risk to themselves or others. Part of what complicates the communication space in emergency responses is that there are several organizations, sectors, orders of government, media outlets involved in the development and distribution of risk messages, in addition to different forms of communication such as radio, TV, websites, social media, that are at the disposal of many of these decision makers. And this adds a further complication to the space as there's so many players that are involved in crafting these messages. Looking to one particular approach that emerges from the literature is referred to mental models. And these are risk communication methods that try to align different ways of thinking about risks between experts and then members of the public or lay people, and then trying to ensure that this expert knowledge is transferred to the public to act on. And next slide, please. As part of our research, we conducted a survey of people with disabilities, and some of the top issues that related to emergency responses and the possibility of needing to evacuate were transportation options, how to get out of their homes, how to get to comfort centers, how to access different transportation options, and even use their own vehicles in a sense. Or in some cases, there would be people that would be needing to intervene. And of course, there's cases where shelter in place is the only option. Access to equipment and supplies. So trying to make sure that there's access to assistive devices, medications, and so on to ensure that people have access to their resources if they are to leave their homes. Also, there's a lot of reliance on someone to intervene, particularly for people without personal support networks that are living far away from family or friends, or that are otherwise isolated in some way. And then also there's the shelter piece, where once someone has evacuated from their home, where are they going to be going? How is this facility going to meet their needs? How accessible is it? How are they going to access again, the equipment and supplies and medical treatment that might be necessary. Next slide, please. I don't think. No. And then, so we look to different sources of information as well that need to be communicated for people with disabilities. And we have found in our research that the methods of communication are very important. And oftentimes there was a noted preference to phone and TV alerts, with door-to-door communication being the least preferred method of communication, which also goes to show that various people within the disability community have various communication needs and preferences as well for how they are receiving information and are interacting with emergency managers. There's also various forms of examples of emergency alerts and different types of communication. So we have the alerts distributed by provincial and municipal emergency management offices. You have emergency responders and national alerting systems, as well as the voluntary municipal alerting system, Halifax Alert. Next slide, please. And one of the most notable findings from the emergency manager side is that there is a wide range of perspectives about the current accessibility of existing emergency management programs and policies, which kind of showed a lack of consensus about how accessible current practices are within the emergency management community. And it also goes to highlight jurisdictional and organizational differences, including various variations in strategy and implementation. And then also varied perspectives at different levels of emergency management. So for example, our surveys got respondents from the municipal level, provincial level, and even some national perspective as well. Next slide, please. So where the research is trying to come in is how can we improve the emergency management response system to adequately meet the needs of people with disabilities, especially going off what's been previously mentioned, that this is sort of an international standard through the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. It's a legislated fundamental part of the Accessible Canada Act. And here in Nova Scotia, we also have accessibility legislation. So not only is this a paramount concern from a moral standpoint and an ethical standpoint, but there's also legislative backing behind this as well. And our main focuses have been to look at how information is gathered, because if information isn't collected and managed properly, it can't be acted on. So there's also a psychological, social, and institutional context to gathering data and the managing of data that needs to be taken in consideration. And then also, as has been mentioned, how is this information shared between organizations? How is it shared between a hierarchy of organizations, and then who has access to it, who's responsible for it, and who is managing the data over time to make sure that it is the most up-to-date and accurate possible. And the most concrete examples come from the examples of different databases and in registries, both that would already exist and could potentially be created. Also, there's an important mechanism to set standards, and much of the focus within the emergency response and accessibility areas has been around having standards in place to try to encourage and enforce there to be accessible policy and programs. However, these can be too bureaucratized at times and may not adequately account for diverse functional needs, as well as various socio-demographic identities and especially intersections thereof. So trying to make sure that the standards that are in place are adequately supporting the people they're meant to, and then also are clear enough that organizations can act upon them. And then also you have sort of the behavior change piece, which would help motivate that enforcement of standards and also encourage it by changing culture. And as has been evidenced in some of our survey responses, is that there can be gaps between the standards that exist and also their implementation. So even if there is a plethora of standards, if they're not meeting the needs, then we need to be doing some evaluation. And then the behavior change also requires appropriate training and deliberate implementation. And next slide, please. So continuing on trying to improve the emergency management system for people with disabilities. We also need to look to improve how people with disabilities are integrated directly in emergency planning, especially in advance of disasters. We need to be having these conversations on bright sunny days when things are going well to be prepared for the next storm. And the traditional way of doing this is often from trying to take a risk expert's knowledge and then communicate that to someone with a disability to try and help inform of what policy and programs are out there, what actions people can take for emergency planning, and even some of the more specific aspects on where to go and how to get there. But we sort of need to be taking into account that the lived experience of people with disabilities, and particularly even the stories that we've heard here today, that should be treated as akin to expert knowledge. It needs to be a two-way transfer of knowledge where both the risk experts are communicating their technical and operational knowledge, and also their awareness of what policies and programs exist and what they can be doing to help support people with disabilities, but also to understand the functional needs of people with disabilities in our community, trying to make sure that various policies and programs are responding to those diverse functional needs, and that there is that two-way transfer of knowledge, as that lived experience should be treated as akin to an expert. And then just a note to thank our funders. This research has been funded by Accessibility Standards Canada and the Social Sciences Humanities Research Council. And we've had numerous advisory board members who have been providing ongoing support, and just numerous disability advocacy organizations, academics from across the country, as well as some private partners and nonprofits as well. And then our next phase of this research will be doing return to the community. And we also will have transportation information and Dr. Albrecht will be sharing her shelter research.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Kaitlynne. That's a great overview of some of the work that we've been doing. I'd like to start by doing a little round of questions amongst ourselves before we refer to any questions that are being posted, though I will invite anyone who would like to post a question, do so in the chat space, and those questions will be fed to me. I want to come back to you, Stephen. One of the things that occurs to me in your comments is the work that's happening at international organizations. And it seems to me that for a number of vulnerable populations, international organizations have an incredibly important for making change at the national and local level. And so we've had some very compelling testimonies this morning about how challenging it is at the street level in managing these responses. So I wonder, what hope can you give us? What are the methods, the mechanisms, the pressures and opportunities that we can apply at international levels to make a difference in the lives of people on the ground?
I have a bit of an untranslate here with the captioning, but I think I understand what you're saying. That in my experience, one of the key factors with this emergency preparedness stuff and what we've seen evolving over some period of time is that the main interventions, if you will, that come in response to these situations of risk tend to come from police and from military folks and things like that. And mechanisms like the UN Convention and other discussions around it are bringing an awareness of disability issues to these individuals and organizations that hadn't previously existed. So if you look at reporting things globally and you listen to what countries are saying in terms of how they're responding to their obligations under the convention, one of the things that's beginning to happen is disability awareness training for military folks and for police officers in these kinds of situations. And you think about it, and if you're talking about your son, and I have a son with significant disability as well, and in a situation where there's an emergency, where all hell is breaking loose, if the police officer or the army person has never interacted with a disabled person, with a deaf person, with a blind person, with a person with a psychosocial disability, and they all of a sudden land themselves in that situation, they say to themselves, well, what am I going to do now? How do I respond to that? So there's beginning to be a discussion about this, and there's beginning to be some training and awareness raising. These are long, slow processes, to be sure. But, as I said, we've been 15 years around the convention, and I think that there's an increasing awareness on the part of these first responders, I guess you'd call them, that, not the whole world is not kind of white, able-bodied, middle-class men. There's a diversity out there. And when they begin to understand that and have training around it, then I think they're much more able to be effective when they get into those situations.
Thank you. Donalda, I want to ask about picking up on some of the work that Kaitlynne's been doing around better integration of persons with disabilities and their caregivers. And I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about the extent to which you feel you've had opportunities to voice concerns or be integrated into professional societies around how to respond to crises? Like, what mechanisms have been available to you to offer a view and help to shape the response? What more needs to be done?
Well, thank you. That's interesting because sometimes what happens is people reach out into certain circumstances where it's easy to reach out into. The more complicated the needs are, the less involved you are with outside agencies that will help you to navigate around the different areas. So I've had to become very proactive in trying to seek out some of these different areas and find out just how we can apply them. But it really, at the end of the day, I don't feel like there's enough in my situation and people who are in similar situations that have been done, because it still comes down to the place where it's a comfort level. Some people's comfort level interferes with how they will interact with people who have disabilities, and that causes a barrier. And so it's trying to remove the barriers. And so on most of the committees and tables that I set, I try to bring home care awareness, because that's where a lot of the attention is needed. And not everybody can go out to different places. Everybody has this thought about maybe we can reach out. Sometimes someone has to reach in because somebody's just not able to reach out. And so that's what makes it a little bit more challenging, is trying to reach the people that you can't reach and that you don't know the needs of those individuals until you actually get into the homes and find out what those individuals need. That's what makes this complicated, because there's not a blanket solution, because everybody's different. So, we have a challenge ahead of us.
And on the question of lists, about compiling lists, what has your experience been with the usefulness, I suppose, of lists for persons with disabilities in terms of facilitating contact and action?
Well, it's interesting because I didn't even realize there was any lists out there until one, and we had sort of fallen through the cracks, and we were directed to the critical care team at Nova Scotia Power as a volunteer group. Outside of that, for myself personally, it's been trying to direct people to that line, direct people to contact their nearest fire station and make sure the fire station is aware that they are in that community and some of their needs, especially if they have oxygen and different things like that. But we really don't have a very good system in place yet. But I believe that through all of this, that we're going to improve that system. But the critical care line at the Nova Scotia Power has been one for me, because I tell you, when your power's out and you're sort of left there and you hear a voice on the other line, not an automated voice, but someone just checking in, seeing how you're doing, it helps to relieve some of the stress and tension. And so if Nova Scotia Power can do it, we can certainly do a better job of it
So
as
there's some
well.
models for us to look at, for sure.
That's right.
Yeah, okay, great. Kaitlynne, I'm going to ask you a question that I think I should probably know the answer to, but I don't. So maybe you do. This question about telecommunications is such a big deal during Fiona and the failure of telecommunications. So has the work revealed any insights, observations about telecommunications, about how we can be doing a better job on telecoms?
Well, definitely after Dorian, we saw that telecommunications were a really big concern, not being able to access internet, not being able to access like cellular data, and even just being able to find updates on what was happening was already raised in 2019 when we had Dorian. So we've again already known these issues. And now we get to Fiona, and we still have the same issues, and even some cases the outages were out for longer periods of time. At least in this case, we saw that there was at least some action taken to try and have some response crews ready, at least more than in past. But it's also shown a light on how telecommunications is essentially governed in the country, and just sort of how much push and pull politicians have, especially at various jurisdictions of government. Like there's a bit of a national lens to consider there. And I think seeing how Premier Houston has been trying to call on telecommunications companies to invest in their own emergency backup abilities. That's at least now been a political conversation, which I think we haven't quite seen in the past. So at least there's some steps been taken there, but it's mostly a matter of putting the money in advance. And the money should have been put in a couple of years ago to make sure that we didn't get to this point. But now there's at least more attention drawn to it.
I think that's an excellent point. One of the interesting things about the telecoms piece, of course, is it's federally regulated, and so much of emergency management is provincially regulated. But this is clearly an area where we need some more work by the feds, the federal regulator, to apply some pressure and bring some reasonable expectations of how we're going to manage what is becoming a much bigger and bigger risk as our dependency increases on the telecoms, but also, as Donalda pointed out, that actually the technology is changing as well, and so the systems are not quite as resilient. I mean, ironically, they're not quite as resilient as maybe they were, or robust actually might be a better word for that one. But they're not as robust as they were. So I think that's an interesting area, but it does introduce the complexity of how different orders of government are working together. Traditionally, the federal government, of course, plays an important role in funding a lot of the emergency response, and of course, they have done with Fiona. But there is this question of applying some pressure, I think, on the regulator on telecoms. So I think that's obviously crucial piece for us to think about, especially given it has had some trouble the last two iterations, these two big storms, and that's probably something it certainly got a lot of attention. Hopefully there'll be some more pressure applied in terms of performance standards. We did receive a question from the online audience. It's a question for Kaitlynne. So Kaitlynne, when it comes to shelters and warming stations, what about service animals and mental health animals? Are they allowed in warming stations? What about food, water, getting outside, et cetera, keeping them warm? Anything to say on animals?
So absolutely, shelter animals are really an important consideration sort of at all aspects of the emergency planning piece. I mean, you need to know what actions you can be taking in advance to prepare and have what you need for service animals. And then also, how do you get your animals from your home as you're evacuating to a comfort facility? And then again, what are the parameters on where the animals will be located? Are they able to be with you at all times? Does that mean that you're in a different space? So all of these things need to be taken into account and prepared for well in advance. A lot of the shelter research is being conducted with Dr. Albrecht, thankfully, but a lot of our findings have been that at the very least, we need to be engaging people that have various service animal needs and trying to make sure that those are accounted for in how we're planning for shelter and accommodations for comfort centers.
Great, thanks, Kaitlynne. A question for Donalda. One of the really interesting things that Donalda mentions is creating human chains to take care of our neighbors, especially our vulnerable neighbors. How can we organize that and create communities where people look after one another?
I think one of the things that we start to do is look at some of our agencies, like, your Lions clubs, go into your communities, see your service providers into your communities, you have church groups. See if we can just connect, and you have your healthcare system connecting with one another, and then coming into a central system so that we have everybody in their names into that central system, so that whatever area the power goes down and they can't be connected, we have people in that area that can reach out. And when I say not just volunteers, what I'm talking about is if somebody has to use their vehicle, that, we can make sure that they have gas, that their gas is covered for the go to those different locations. But I think that we can start with some of the organizations that we have. You take Mental Health Foundation of Nova Scotia and different organizations like that who have a volunteer list of names, and find out if people would want their names connected to a chain. And with this chain, that we could make sure that we have people covered at all times in our communities. It's something that we need to think about and something that we need to do.
Right. Stephen, are there specific opportunities that our audience stays largely members of the community of a particular concern and interest, of course, for people with disabilities? Are there particular opportunities that they should be aware of and thinking about in terms of thinking of these issues, in terms of international organizations or agreements or things to which they can participate? I guess opportunities that might exist for them to leverage and apply pressure for change?
Sure, I've talked a bit about reporting under the CRPD. And that's a regular thing that happens every 4 years. So we're just in the middle of the second report. And what we're doing is, and when I say we, I'm working with a small group of people across the country, but we're connecting to different community organizations that have interest in the different provisions of the convention and asking them to respond to the questions that the CRPD committee asked. This has all been put on pause because of the pandemic, but we're just now in the process of coordinating with national disability organizations around the different provisions of the convention and the questions that the committee has asked. And if there are folks out there who are interested, then I'd invite them to be in touch with me. I don't know whether my email address can be shared with people. I'm happy to do that if they want. Certainly, if you're interested in talking about things related to Article 11, situations of risk, then I'd be happy to have input from people about that. And if there are other areas where people are interested, I'm happy to talk with people about that as well. But while I have the floor, I wanted to make a comment that related to another question, to talking about service animals and things, because I think that a lot of times people, I mean, we think about people who have disabilities in these kinds of situations, and I think that, that the tendency is to think about people who have, sensory disabilities or physical disabilities and things like that. But a large percentage of people who have disabilities have hidden disabilities. We talk about service animals and talk about animals that are support animals for people who have psychosocial disabilities and things. And it's difficult in these kinds of emergency situations, I think, or people in those situations often get overlooked and things. So in terms of planning, you're talking about the different kinds of things that have been done. I think that a lot more attention needs to be paid to people who have hidden disabilities, because it's very easy for them to be overlooked. So I just like to flag that people have thoughts or comments about it. I'd be interested to hear them.
Okay, thank you for that. I want to ask you something. I want to pick up on something you mentioned, Stephen, and this is your reference to the pandemic, if I may. So you say that these things paused during the pandemic. What attention did the pandemic bring to this space in terms of emergency? This is a different kind of emergency, thinking about the pandemic. Maybe the parameters or definition are a little different. Some reflections on the pandemic, how it brought this question of risk management into focus.
To be candid with you, I think we're just trying to figure out what the impact of these things are. In terms of reporting on the CRPD, I can tell you that we went to Geneva to meet with the CRPD committee in 2019, and we were expected to file a report in 2020 and meet with the committee again about that in 2020. Now we're at the end of 2022, and we have yet to write the report. So things have really, they've gone off the rails in a lot of ways. And the way these processes go is that the committee looks at what's going on, and they ask a series of questions. The questions that were asked in 2019, and we're responding to those 2019 questions. But the world has really changed quite considerably since 2019. So we met by Zoom, like everybody does now, with the people on the committee to talk about how to manage this and so on. And what they've told us is that we have a lot more latitude in terms of our reporting and our responding than we would have initially had, and so we can talk about the situation of the pandemic and so on. But we're just now as we get organized, beginning to talk or beginning to look at things and really try to figure out what the impact of the pandemic has been on people with disabilities. And you know, it let me just stop at that.
So we do have some special guests with us in our audience today, so we'll refer to them and ask if they have questions. David, have you got a question for us?
Yes, the technology is technology enabled questions. A really simple question. We're not alone in this, right? There are jurisdictions all over the world that are confronted with the same kinds of challenges. And I'm just wondering if the panelists can provide some insights into cases they know where things have been done better, where some of these processes have been put in place and that deal with some of the same kinds of jurisdictional challenges and what we can learn from those other gold standards, if you like, that are out there.
Kaitlynne, you want to start that one off? I think Kaitlynne's done some
Yeah,
work in that area.
I'm happy to start off and also just highlight that even like looking nationally, there's some interesting things happening across Canada in this space. So I've noted the Disability Emergency Management Network out of Manitoba, for example, which is a coalition of emergency responding organizations, dispatch, all those sort of institutions, as well as disability advocacy organizations. And it's a formalized group that is under their emergency response that brings these two groups together. And I believe the impetus was it was actually seeing the US experience after Hurricane Katrina and sort of looking to themselves and thinking, okay, we need to take action here. Other examples in British Columbia, there's a coalition for people with disabilities organizations. And they also have a specific aspect of their operations where they look to emergency responses and how they can support people with disabilities in their community. So a lot of those deliberate spaces where you are having people with disabilities and that lived experience meeting with emergency management organizations to try and have that knowledge transfer are really big, and having those occur well in advance and ongoingly and regularly before a disaster is also really important. And then looking at even internationally, the sort of one that stands out to me in my mind, although it's been a little bit since I was looking at this particular research, but New Zealand, in just how they have tried to sort of integrate accessibility throughout many aspects of their services, policies, programs, and trying to learn from the earthquakes in Christchurch. For example, New Zealand has been really trying to make some progressive headway, and even just how they think about disability in a policy context, which is a little bit more nuanced and expansive and fluid than we've been working with in the Canadian context, which is much more regimented and categorized of you have this type of disability and this type of disability, and so trying to actually have a little bit more of a fluid understanding.
Thank you, Kaitlynne. Donalda or Stephen, please go ahead.
Just to quickly say, I mentioned during the CRPD drafting, the tsunami, and the government of Japan was very, they became very involved in these discussions. And I know that there's been quite a lot of work with the Japanese disability community in terms of emergency response. And there've been conferences that have been held in Japan to look specifically at the situation or the response of emergency measures, both in light of the tsunami and other things. So there are certainly places around the world where this is being taken quite seriously, and a lot of work is being done around it.
Donalda, some thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would agree, especially in the Denmark model. They have a fantastic model as well, where they focus in on persons with disabilities and make sure that the persons with disabilities actually are not invisible people. And I think that's the thing that I really admire about theirs, is that they incorporate everybody into their emergency measure system and making sure that they try and know where people are, how they're located, and just how to deal with them. And something that we certainly could look at here. It's by making people not invisible.
Great question. Thank you, David. Because obviously lots of content for us.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Laura McPherson. I'm with our Accessibility Directorate here in Nova Scotia. Really important conversation and very timely, of course, as well. So we've been talking about some of the responses we've heard from advocates in the disability community around wanting a vulnerable persons registry in Nova Scotia. And Donalda, you mentioned a registry is maybe a starting point, but it's not enough. We can't just have a list. And Kaitlynne, you mentioned we have an Accessibility Act here in Nova Scotia, and through our Access by Design 2030 framework, the government of Nova Scotia has made a commitment to lead by example in advancing accessibility. So with that said, my question for all of you, and maybe Donalda, you could speak to this first, knowing that you had mentioned we need a plan now. We need a plan now for the next time we have an emergency that comes to Nova Scotia. So what do you see the provincial government's role being in the short term, knowing that we do have this bureaucratic reality in government? It does take time to create systems change. What would you like to see government do to play a leadership role to help address this issue?
Thank you. I'd like to see the government take an active role in actually knowing where vulnerable people are located in the province and actually paying much more attention to home care. Because I think if you focus in on the people that are in their homes, you're going to focus in on a lot of people who have disabilities that are not necessarily on a disability chart somewhere. So I'd like to see the government really pay more attention and really focus in on home care.
Kaitlynne, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so just extending on that, I think there's a lot to be done to kind of look at what the province has done and had tried to do in the past. The example of a vulnerable persons registry actually has been a frequent conversation in Nova Scotia, even from about a decade ago. So there's been a lot of attempts to try and look at what this could look like. And sort of, again, as Donalda was saying, it's sort of a matter of how that information is collected and used and how it can be managed and kept up to date and accurate. And there are different models within Nova Scotia that we can look to, such as the Nova Scotia Critical Care Power Program. And I think that a lot of what needs to happen is just these conversations need to be more frequent, and they need to be, again, regular and a part of the institutional landscape. It can't just be these one-off ad hoc conversations. And also people with disabilities need to be brought in at the very beginning of developing these policies and programs. It can't be that a program is created and then you're asked, how can we make this more accessible to you? That universal principle of accessibility really needs to try and be embedded from the ground up through everything. And the best way to do that is make sure that people with disabilities are at the forefront of that conversation and that they have a legitimized view within an institutional structure to convey their needs and make decisions.
Stephen, any thoughts on this? Any thoughts on this, Stephen?
Yeah, I actually have a comment here. Both the province of Nova Scotia and the government of Canada have in the last few years adopted accessibility legislation. Now, I know at least at the federal level, the process, and I think it's the same in the province, correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that the process that unfolds is standards are developed in different areas. And I don't know myself whether or not there's going to be a discussion about standards in terms of emergency response kinds of situations. I think if there isn't one, we should be lobbying and advocating for one, because as you point out, the jurisdictional challenges are significant here with, the federal government having responsibility in some areas, the province having responsibility in other areas, and also municipalities having responsibilities. And there's not a lot of coordination between these things. But I think that if there are going to be standards developed, there really ought to be standards developed in this area. It would be a very important thing to do.
Excellent. Stephen Estey, Donalda MacIsaac, and Kaitlynne Lowe, thanks so much for a great discussion today on this really important subject. As Kaitlynne points out, and I'm sure we all agree, we need to have those conversations more often. We need to integrate these concepts and ideas into our thinking, into our daily lives, as well as the public institutions that serve us. So on that, I'll just say thanks so much for joining the McKechnie Institute's event today. We will have this available on our YouTube channel, and we would encourage you to distribute it to those who are interested, and I'm sure there will be many. So thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing you again next time at the McKechnie Institute.